It's always such a delight to see friends and colleagues and students come together and meet each other anew, catch up at events like these. I'm Holly Tucker. I direct the Robert Penn Warren Center for the Humanities. And it's my distinct pleasure for me to welcome you all to this year's Harry C. Howard Jr. Lecture, sponsored by our center. The Howard Lecture is a signature event at Vanderbilt each year, drawing, as we see today, an audience from all over campus as well as the community. Before I tell you a little bit about the Howard Lecture series, I'd like to extend my sincere, profuse thanks to the staff that we have. Each year, we pull off an event like this, as well as we did the count for the fall, 128 programs, meetings at the center. And we couldn't do it without Elizabeth Meadows, our associate director, Phoebe Thompson, the inimitable Terry Tripp, and our pride and joy, Shrish Kumar in the back, who has been our student worker for the last 4 years. And I promise you that the team will all cry tears when he leaves. So the Howard Lecture was established in 1994 through the endowment of Mr. and Mrs. Thomas E. Nash Jr. and Mr. and Mrs. George Renfro of Asheville, North Carolina, to honor their friend and attorney by establishing a lecture series in his name at his alma mater. While Mr. Howard is unable to be here in person today, we are grateful for his support, which has allowed us to bring in so many notable speakers through the years, such as playwright Kiara Hudes, former NEH chairman John Parrish Peedy, author James McBride, real estate developer and social justice advocate Majora Carter, Latinx writer Jakira Diaz, and the list goes on. This afternoon, we welcome acclaimed writer and journalist, author CalFlyn, as our Howard lecturer. Cal is an award-winning writer from the Highlands of Scotland. Her first book, Thicker Than Water, about frontier violence in colonial Australia, was a Times Book of the Year. Her second book, which you all have a copy in front of you, signed, her second book, Islands of Abandonment, about the ecology and psychology of abandoned places, has been shortlisted for numerous literary awards, including the Wainwright Prize for Writing on Global Conservation, the British Academy Book Prize, and the Bailey Gifford Prize for Nonfiction, among others. Cal's journalistic writing has been published in Granta, National Geographic, The Wall Street Journal, The Sunday Times, The Economist. The list again goes on. She was previously writer-in-residence at Gladstone's Library and at the Jan Milkowski Foundation in Switzerland. She was made a McDowell Fellow in 2019, and in 2022, she was announced the Sunday Times Young Writer of the Year. Last year's Harry Howard lecturer, writer, and biologist David Haskell, who is sitting here with us. It's a treat to see him again. It was a fantastic talk last year. Described Islands of Abandonment as full of surprise and hope, spiced with horror, a vivid guide to the strange and resilient life of seemingly ruined and waste spaces, one that calls us to new understandings of beauty and nature. The New Yorker noted that Flyn captures the dread, sadness, and wonder of beholding the results of humanity's destructive impulse, and she arrives at a new appreciation of life, all the stranger and more valuable for its resilience. Booklist described her work as brave, unflinching, and keenly observant. Flyn writes with the soul of a poet and the eye of a painter. It's now my pleasure to welcome Cal, and thank you for being here and for being such a treat to work with as we plan this event.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here at Vanderbilt. It's really a joy and a pleasure to be here on your beautiful campus. And I've had such interesting conversations over the last few days. So it's, yes, I'm so pleased. So thank you. Let me just check. I can work this. Sorry, I can't get this clicker to work. No. No. There we go. It's working? Yeah. This one? Great. So I'm going to talk to you today about a project I was working on for a number of years. And in a sense, I'm still sort of mentally working on this project. I call it Islands of Abandonment, and I think it ties in very well with what you talk about in mending, transforming, this idea of repairing past damage. My project concentrates on largely the ecology of natural recovery. So what happens to damaged landscapes, what I came to call post-human landscapes, which might mean they are polluted, they are post-industrial. I went to a site of nuclear meltdown, a site where there was a volcanic exclusion zone where people had been forced to leave. And then what I was looking at was what happens in the absence of humans. I guess these were, in my mind, almost like control experiments. If you're not going in and trying to restore a landscape, what happens? Does it recover? What species come to the fore? So I picked 12 locations. This is Montserrat in the Caribbean. This is the volcanic exclusion zone I mentioned. And I think the way that I came to think about it was that these were almost thought experiments made real. I talk about them being forbidden experiments because it would be immoral to bring them around. They have come with enormous human cost, often great natural ecological cost, but they also tell us a great deal about this capacity for regeneration that exists in the world around us. So I spent 2 years traveling to places where I guess the worst has already happened. These were often places that it made me feel like I was stepping into a sci-fi book or some kind of dystopian vision of the future. And I expected these places would be dark, that I would write a book of dark prophecies, that this might be the future of the earth. And in fact, what it turned into was almost a book of redemption stories, ones that I found very moving and unexpected. I'll first start talking about one of the basic effects of having exclusion zones. So this is a lack of disturbance. So we see when plants flood back into this kind of landscape, it's actually quite unusual in the world for you to have these conditions. An interesting case study that ended up being sort of the focus of this chapter in my book was the green line in Cyprus. So this stretches across the island east to west. It's been there since 1974 when there was an invasion of Turkish troops. It's a very tightly policed UN demilitarized zone. And it goes from end to end, 112 miles long, is anything from 11 feet wide. So that's just literally the width of a road to several miles, 4.6 miles. It encompasses entire villages, and it also splits the capital of the island, Nicosia, in half. As you can see, this is actually a slightly different part of the zone. This is held by Turkish troops or Turkish allied troops. And what happens inside is that you have these fences and life goes on very normally on one side of the fence. And on the other side, you have this sort of blooming or a return of green life. Rebecca Solnit once wrote about the blue of distance, and this is the green of time. You find that it happens by itself. And it happens through a number of different processes. But what you get is this surprising biodiversity. In 2008, there were a group of scientists from both sides of the island. It was in a a joint scientific mission trying to bring both sides of the island together, sponsored by the UN. They went inside this demilitarized zone, which is usually completely off limits. And they set up camera traps looking for nature. They had 8 different places across the island in all sorts of different habitats. And what they found was really interesting. So they found barn owls bedding down in cracks and holes in the masonry of buildings all over the place, in an abandoned and very ruinous airport, which was the focus of a lot of violent fighting during the invasion in 1974. They found snakes basking on the cracked runway. They found falcons living in the lookout tower. You know, on an island that's as densely inhabited and densely developed as Cyprus, and it's also somewhere where there's a lot of hunting of songbirds, you'll find that these become unexpectedly safe havens. For a long time, this was an area that was mined, and so it was very dangerous for people to go inside. A small number of people do, and in some areas it's still farmed under a special licensing agreement, but actually largely it is untouched. And as I say, these are very unusual situations. So I've put some of the sort of scientific literature at the bottom. So anyone who's interested in reading more, I really recommend. This is a very interesting paper. So the thing is, it's not that war is good for nature. It absolutely is not. I mean, we should be clear about that. War causes incredible damage, both to human communities and to the natural landscape. I'll talk a little bit in a minute about battlefields of the First World War, where there were 10,000 years of natural erosion due to shell damage. I mean, war is an incredibly destructive force, and we should not ever applaud it or encourage it. What these are is it's a state of stalemate. And this is actually a kind of historical condition that's come about, you know, many times in the past. You have a violent conflict, and then you have this unsettling moment afterwards. So the first time that this was sort of studied, this effect of natural regeneration in no man's lands, we look at the Lewis and Clark expedition. So this is 1804 to 1806. They recorded the game that they found while traveling through America. And they began to notice a pattern in their data, which was that while they were traveling through areas where the Native American nations were at war, there was a sort of buffer zone between these zones where the different nations didn't want to step in unless it was sort of fighting parties. And in these areas, actually, you find these incredible natural blooming of bison or deer or anything you want. It was inside this area, which was very troubled in the human realm. So you also find this in the present day in sort of rainforest areas between tribes that are at war with each other. The IUCN noted that this was an effect that you see in both the Amazon and also in Papua New Guinea, that you have these buffer zone effects of incredible natural biodiversity. And you also find it, so for example, after the Iran-Iraq war, there was a region of a mined region between the two countries where the Persian leopard, it began to regrow. There were only several thousands left in the world, but because of the way that they walk and they spread their weight, they very rarely have one foot down on the ground at once. It meant that they didn't put enough weight on their feet to set the mines off. And so that this became this like incredibly policed, inadvertently policed reserve in which they managed to recover their numbers. One of the, I don't know, the sort of famous examples that perhaps initially sort of sparked my interest in this area is the Chernobyl exclusion zone. So here is inside a former sports hall. Before the current war, it was relatively easy to visit the region. And I already feel, you know, these images that I have now and the notes that I have from that time are a sort of souvenir of a time gone by. It is a very interesting case because it makes us think a lot about the trade-off that we have between positive and negative forces. So there was a huge impact on nature in the immediate aftermath of the nuclear disaster in 1986. The strange thing was that over time, because again, this is quite a policed exclusion zone, although it's porous in unexpected ways, or it certainly was. Already by a decade later, we were finding that the animal populations in the zone had doubled in number, almost any species that they were keeping track of. They found that wolves had increased 7-fold by 2010, and they found that bears had returned to the area by 2014 for the first time in more than a century. So again, it is this question of, is not so much the damage as the stability that followed that allowed this sort of incredible natural regeneration to happen. I think it's very key, again, to think about that stability in terms of human timescales. How, as a species, how volatile we are and how short our memories are and how rare it is for regions to be left for any length of time. It's very difficult for us to think more than a few years in advance. And that actually causes us a great deal of trouble when we are thinking of projects, conservation projects, for example, that require decades or generations even of foresight. Here we find in Chernobyl last February, the exclusion zone was invaded by soldiers. So 1,000 soldiers were present within the exclusion zone, digging trenches, disturbing dust. And there was a great deal of anxiety again, because the conditions that had allowed this incredible recovery were again at risk. And so it does give us a sense of how difficult it can be to foster these conditions over a long period of time. I mean, a question is, you know, how dangerous is the zone? How is this able to happen? You know, it is a complicated question with a complicated answer, but ultimately, I think the simplest way of talking about it is that radioactive material comes in many different flavors. From a human point of view, what we are most anxious about is radioactive iodine. This is what lodges in your thyroid. It causes a lot of damage if it's there in a large amount. It can cause cancer, some of which is treatable and some not. The lucky thing, I suppose, is that iodine 131, it has a very short half-life of 8 days. That means within a month already the radioactive levels of iodine had dropped to a 14th of their original amount. Now what we're most concerned about within the zone is cesium and strontium. These have around 3 decades half-life. And so when you start thinking in these scales, it's going to be a very, very long time. I think it's about 100,000 years before we can really consider the zone to be safe. But the question of what safe means is somewhat subjective. You know, for the animals that live in the zone and the plants that grow in the zone, they are able to survive. It might not be peak conditions for them. And in fact, a lot of them are themselves, their bodies are radioactive because of the amount of cesium and strontium that they have absorbed either through eating or generally from being in that environment. But it is not necessarily enough that they are unable to live and to breed. And this is how these numbers have begun to grow over time. We also see a sort of self-selection between the different species that are able to survive. This is an area called Yanov. This is inside the exclusion zone. It's a former railway siding. It was very forested with pine trees. Pine trees were also what made up the red forest, which is an area of forestry that died very dramatically in the immediate aftermath of the meltdown. Here in Yanov, it's a little bit further away, so many of the pine trees did survive, but you can see how the history of the zone is actually etched into their very bodies. Here, where on the outside it becomes darker, the rings are closer together, it's been far less conducive to their growth. And so we see one element of what we might call ecological history, either in the bodies of the plants themselves or in the species assemblage of what is able to survive in these new conditions. Largely, the pine trees actually are not able to survive. You can walk through, I saw pine trees that were, I don't know, sort of seeming to writhe. They have grown and mutated. These mutations are naturally occurring anyway, so it is quite difficult to say exactly how much of it is tied to the radioactivity in the region. But it does seem that the pine trees are particularly susceptible. What is able to survive is silver birch. And so within the Chernobyl exclusion zone, this was a very arable area, a farming area. And what it now is 70% of forest. Much of this is silver birch because it's very, very good at surviving in all sorts of strange conditions. So here's another site. This is the Bings of West Lothian in Scotland. This is a post-industrial site in the country where I'm from. These Bings were formed during the 19th century. It was part of the shale oil mining industry. It was an early way of producing something like paraffin. And what happened was that they would dig up the oil shale, superheated so that the oil extraction process would happen. It would begin to drip down the sides and gather. You could use it as fuel, and you were left with these. It's like tiny pieces of gravel. They're called blaze. So in Scotland, it's actually very, very common that you have this now as like a surface to football fields and what you call soccer. And everyone hates it because it really is a bad surface to fall on. But here you have these incredible, they're almost like Uluru. There's these landforms which are made of these bright red pieces of gravel. They're not really held together by anything in particular. They're almost like giant sand dunes, and they are post-industrial souvenirs. What we're seeing here is essentially a slow process that you would call succession, which is how these different plants come to sort of take over sites. In fact, this is called primary succession because it means it's basically starting from nothing. These were absolutely sterile, superheated. In fact, for many years, they kept bursting into flame. They were kind of dangerous for a long time. The last blaze, Bing, was still being built in the 1960s. So some of them are more recent than others. What happens is that to begin with, we have things like lichen, moss. These come in and they begin to stabilize the surface of the Bings. Over time, you then start having what you call ruderal plants. I love this word. It's like ruderal is like from the rubble. And this is like wildflowers. It can be certain types of grasses, things that are able to go in and again stabilize. And over time, as you see down at the bottom, this is a very messy place. It's the kind of place that teenagers love to go hang out. Also, dirt bikers go here. Down at the bottom, you can see where silver birch, again, the sort of hero of succession, is coming into play. So we have all of these different species here. It's interesting because part of my book was almost like looking at these landscapes and trying to see them in a different way. Often we don't really like these messy landscapes because they seem to us to be somehow impure or unpicturesque, unattractive in some way, and they make us feel a little bit nervous, these feral sites. But, you can find sites of unusual beauty, this sort of strange Martian landscape. And again, so there was an interesting survey by a PhD student in Edinburgh. She did a survey that found more than 350 plant species on the Bings, more than can be found in Ben Nevis, which is the biggest mountain that we have in our country. And so it gives you a sense of this sort of strange mixing that's going on in these places. Like there's so much potential, partly because it's coming from a standing start. There's a lot of competition going on between different species. And there's this beautiful concept called seed rain, which is like how some seeds, especially sort of windborne seeds, rain down. They're swept up into the atmosphere and then they rain down. And then it's a randomizing process. They happen to land somewhere where they're able to make a life, to grow. They do that. And so you find in a place like this really unexpected mixes of different species. And so sometimes it might be garden plants that have been swept up maybe from miles away or maybe from the nearest town or village. Then you also have species on the top of the mountains, which are on the mountains of gravel. They are subarctic species and the kind of thing that you might find in the Cairngorms, our mountain range. And so you have this very strange, you don't really know how to look at it or how to understand it while you're walking there as a person. So yeah, an interesting thing about the Bings was that there were attempts, partly because they were so unpopular locally, there were really a post-industrial hangover. Hang on, I'll go back a bit. I'm getting ahead of myself. So a sort of post-industrial hangover. So for a while, there were like pressure that they wanted to regenerate them, restore them, somehow make them better. And so there's a really interesting study, again, the same student who went out and she compared the ones that had been changed in the name of conservation or regeneration. They'd been smoothed over, they'd been greened, they'd had fertilizer added to them. And in fact, over time, these places were doing a lot worse because they'd become gardens that were no longer being tended. They couldn't last. Whereas these places, the only species that could survive were the ones that were like sort of fighting weight. They'd come in and then they were fighting for their space. And so we'd actually set back these landscapes by trying to improve them, to prettify them. I think like thinking about this made me sort of wonder, like, what do we mean by pretty? What do we mean by beautiful? And again, like, so this is Edward Bertinsky. Some of you might be familiar with his work, Canadian photographer. And I read this really interesting piece about him, which talked about how his work is a clash of ethics and aesthetics, a political tension that can be quite agitated. And I thought, absolutely, you know, it's agitating. You look at these sites which are often incredibly human impacted, and yet you can also look at them and see something beautiful in them. In his images, it's very specifically aesthetic beauty. In the places that I went to, it was often ecological beauty or ecological virility of some kind, or you could begin to find a value that you had not originally felt them to hold. So I guess I'm interested as a writer in sort of ethical dilemmas, places where there's not necessarily a right answer, or there are sort of unexpected positives to terrible things. I don't know. I mean, from a literary perspective, it's what moves me. So another place that sent me down sort of interesting paths, interesting logic was this site. This is in France. It's very close to the site of the Battle of Verdun, and it was one of the most bitterly fought battlefields of the First World War. I mean, as I said earlier, you know, 10,000 years of natural erosion, you know, when you saw the landscape after the fighting, it was unrecognizable. It was this bare, you know, that any trees that were left were completely blasted, falling apart. It was really mud. It's full of unexploded ordnance. It's full of bodies that will never be dug up. What they did after the war was that they took 200,000 unspent chemical weapons and they piled them up in this farm. And didn't know what to do with these chemical weapons. They wanted to take them out of commission. And so what they did was they set them on fire. This is the site where they did that. As you can see, there's a sort of gray, sandy stuff. This is ash. It's like very rich in heavy metals. It's very poisonous. They did a survey of it later. A team of German scientists found that it was 17% of the soil's weight is arsenic. 13% zinc, 2.6% lead. You know, this is very damaging. These are heavy metals, it's bad for plant life. Then partly because of a sort of local amnesia, you know, people who lived in this area had so much to process and so much had happened, it was sort of forgotten. And this, they have what's called the Zone Rouge in France, and this is an area where it's very recommended you don't walk. They planted trees to try and secure this soil that was full of horrible contaminants. And then they left it. And so it's been a long time now. And this was a sort of strange clearing in the woods. Nobody really knew what to do. Some foresters built this hut and they loved to hang out there. This was before they knew how much arsenic was in the soil. And then the scientists figured it out and they had to fence it off. So as you can see on the left, it's now a very strange place to visit. It's really kind of beautiful, fairy tale-esque, but it's like, if you know the history, it's just absolutely sort of soaked in anxiety and fear. What I was interested in were these plants that are beginning to grow here. They shouldn't really. It's very unusual that you should have plants that are able to grow in toxic soil like this. We have a certain kind of grass that grows there. I think in America you call it velvet grass. You also have a type of moss and a type of lichen. So some of these plants, well, two of those plants, they're able to grow here because they sort of shut themselves off. They just don't pick up any of this arsenic, none of that. And so they've got a sort of quite a sensible way of dealing with it. And another one is really interesting. It's called hyperaccumulating plant. And that means it loves the heavy metal for some reason. And we still don't really know why. It sucks it from the earth and it stores it in its body. And there's a small number of plants like this in the earth, and they're of great scientific interest, partly because we don't understand why. It might be a sort of defense mechanism, make themselves bitter herbs so that they're very unpleasant to eat. They are, you know, probably poisonous to a lot of species. And you get some really interesting examples. So here are a few. So spring sandwort, top left. So this is very rare in the UK. And I came across it on a former copper smelting site, which is now declared a site of special scientific interest. And they were really in a bind there because, again, they tried to improve the site. And what had happened was because they had reduced the amount of copper in the soil, these rare plants were beginning to disappear and they didn't know what to do. Like, what do we do? Do we dig it up? Do we retoxify the soil? That seems crazy. Bottom left, this is calamine violet. So again, all of these are naturally occurring. But this was used by people, they called it bioprospecting. So you could find zinc by looking for these plants. And so in the early days of mining, they would look for these plants. You get something called calamine grassland. And again, this is sort of an unusual mix of species. Top right, yellow tuft. So this is an interesting, again, group of plants that you have when is now being investigated for something called phytomining. And that's because it sucks so much of the metals up from these toxified soils that actually they themselves possibly become quite valuable. And so what you can do is you can begin to dry them out, you can burn them, and then you're left with a sort of metal remainder, which you can then sell. And so this is a science that's very much in like the early days. It's a sort of baby science, and they're still trying to make sure that it makes economic sense, but it is very promising. And there's something I think quite beautiful about it as well. This last one here is a really interesting example, Pycnandra acuminata. You find it on New Caledonia. And as you can see, it has this very strange, almost like verdigris-like sap. So it can store up to 26% nickel, you know, in its body weight. So it's an incredible plant. And again, like why it does this is not entirely clear, but when we're talking about trying to remediate sites that have been very toxified by human use, these plants are of a great deal of interest, and they might be a very efficient way of dealing with that in the future. One more thing here that I wanted to talk about. This is, hang on. So this pattern of abandonment, there are some other positives as well. So it's not just that it flags up interesting species, but abandonment, especially farmland abandonment, is happening on this incredible scale around the world. It's a little bit difficult to keep a track of, partly because, you know, people just don't record things that fall out of use. And so it's a bit difficult to know. But so I ended up going to Estonia to write about what had happened to farmland after the collapse of the Soviet Union. What happened there was that they had a system of collective farming, and you know, essentially overnight, the system didn't really work anymore. These farms that had been family farms had been combined into these enormous blocks of land. And then enough time had passed that when they were trying to split them up again, they couldn't reunite them with their owners. And so you have these enormous, on the left, this was from a dairy farm. It was like a huge milking shed that at some stage would have had, you know, 10,000 head of cattle in it. This is no longer really workable in contemporary Estonia, you know, it doesn't work on that scale. And again, here, this is a hothouse. It's full of raspberries and other plants, which are now completely going wild. So in Estonia, what had happened was that I think it went from around 15% of forestry to more than half. Around 90% of the forestry that you find in Estonia now is naturally regenerated. And again, this is a pattern that we're seeing all around the world in different amounts, particularly in the former Soviet Union. In fact, I have a map here showing actually where it's most concentrated. And then also in parts of South America, parts of East Asia, huge amounts. So as you can see, some areas of what is now Russia is more than 80% abandoned. Some of these areas have been abandoned because they are not great for farming in, and therefore they recover more slowly. Forestry might grow there more slowly, but some areas are really springing into life. There's some incredible figures that we have here. So a 2013 study estimated the carbon sink in Russia to be at 42.5 million tons of carbon a year, every year since 1990. And it means that, you know, if these figures are correct, it's difficult to say, but technically Russia would have easily surpassed the terms of the Kyoto Agreement purely through land abandonment alone. I mean, this is the scale. I don't think we should let them off exactly on their environmental requirements, but it's more to give you a sense of the scale of what we're talking about. And this has a lot of historical precedents. So in the US, we saw agricultural abandonment on a large scale as far back as the 1860s. It's tended to be people moving from the Northeast into what you might call the breadbasket, basically easier areas to farm. If you walk around in Maine, New Hampshire, all sorts of places, you will find these like dry stone walls in the middle of the woods and old buildings and all of this. it's really incredible to think that at the time that Thoreau was writing, actually, that was when deforestation in the region was at its peak. It's far more forested now than it was at that time. So yeah, in the US, forest has grown pretty much through land abandonment by 360,000 hectares every year between 1910 and the end of the 20th century. The reason I talk about that is to kind of give you an idea of the scale of what we're talking about, which is that this is a pattern that is happening on an enormous scale across the world and often unnoticed. And it's difficult to know exactly how to deal with this sort of mentally, like should we be relieved? Should we be doing something about it? And I think from my point of view, it was just interesting to try and unite all this research from around the world and see what we know, see what's happening. So that's from an ecological perspective. I was also interested in the other side. I talk about it being a book of ecology and psychology. Initially, when I first started writing about abandonment, I sort of didn't want to talk about people. You know, that seemed to be the opposite of what I was trying to do. And every time I went to these abandoned places, there were just people were there getting in the way of what I was trying to write about. And it took a while for me to realize that actually that this was part of the story. Actually, abandonment only works in the context of humans. It's defined by something that we have done to it. And actually human stories are at the heart of it. And to disregard that was inhumane. You know, as I said before, you know, a lot of these places that I went to study have got a very sad, tragic human history. And so I had to reflect that in the writing, of course, and speak to people about that, how that continued to affect them. And also, you know, what was happening? How do abandoned places affect people now? Because often I went there and there were people there and they were having some kind of reaction to this place. This ended up being sort of, I started to see it as abandoned places having this almost like bipolar effect in us. Like we had an attraction to abandoned places and also a repulsion. In Detroit, I spoke to a lot of people who were very worried about abandonment within the city. They saw it, not invariably, but many of them saw it as being just a very negative force. So if you have an abandoned building, there is a kind of contagion to it in as much as the buildings around it are much more likely to become abandoned, partly because they lose value. And also there are more at physical risk. So they're more likely to, well, abandoned buildings are more likely to go on fire, and therefore so are the buildings around them. They also, abandoned buildings also tend to be a sort of hub for crime, especially violent crime. And so there is a sort of fear, which is a rational fear around abandoned spaces, especially in urban environments. So I talked there to people who I guess were trying to turn the tide. That did seem to me that I had to reflect that as well, that abandonment is not wholly a positive thing. So this was me out with the Michigan Humane Society. We're looking for feral dogs running loose in some of the enormous factories that you find at the heart of that city. And I was very moved actually by a lot of the people that I spoke to who were trying to turn around what they described as blight. I know that this is a commonly used term in the US, but for me, from the outside, we don't use that word at home. I find it a very provocative idea, this idea of it being it's a metaphor for disease and the contagion. And so I thought it was worth digging down into that. And it made me think about it a lot. People would go out and they would try to stem this blight, usually in physical ways by boarding up houses or knocking them down, sometimes without help from the local government. And also they would cut the grass, they would restore children's playgrounds, things like this. And that had a very real sociological and criminological effect. And then there is the sort of opposite side of that. If that's the repulsion and the sort of negative side of abandonment, there's also something else in there as well. I came to see it as almost universal. That many people are drawn to these places. You know, I spoke to a lot of people who are urban explorers. They go out, they seek these places out. This is a picture taken in Paterson, New Jersey, where I made friends with a local guy who spends a lot of time in the industrial mills at the heart of that city. And he introduced me to people there that they saw each other almost as like a sort of loose, welcoming community. Some people were homeless, other people were not, and were just choosing to hang out there, sometimes to take drugs, sometimes not, sometimes to create art. And to them, the way that they spoke about these places surprised me. It was like a source of freedom. to like step out of the normal strictures of society. And they found that it sort of freed their brain, it freed their personalities in a way that they did not feel that they had elsewhere. It is a frightening experience, I think, often to walk through these places because it is risky, but sometimes people want risk in their life and they seek it out. I think, again, I found this a provocative idea and one that I related to without even thinking about it too much. And that these places, it was like a sense of the sublime, that what we were seeking out in these places was very similar to what we might look for in enormous landscapes. You know, the lack of humans does something, I think, powerful to the human brain. And the fear that is inherent in these places is also very important. So you combine the beauty with the fear, and it becomes a very, very powerful psychological experience. So finally, I'll just close up here, but as a final location, I went to an abandoned island. This is off the north coast of Scotland. It's very close to where I live now. It's an island that was abandoned in 1979. The last people to live there were, it was a family. They'd been there for many decades alone. And the brother and sister had grown very elderly and had to be evacuated quite swiftly for medical reasons. They always intended to come back. They left overnight. And so just as they were leaving, they opened the gate, they let the cattle out, and they were like, see you later. And then they never came back. And what's happened here on this island is that there's been this herd of feral cattle. Again, this is a very unusual thing to happen. You only see feral cattle of this kind, very small number of cases. There was Amsterdam Island, but they were all culled not so very long ago. And so they've become a focus of some scientific interest, like how wild are these cattle? You know, how do they behave? You know, where we're not policing their behavior, where we're not checking, you know, the gender balance within them. And the answer is very unpredictably, they behave a lot more like wild deer, wild horses. They can be quite aggressive. I'd say probably more defensive than aggressive, but you really don't want to get in their way. They are very alert, and they sort of would stalk me around the island. The island's about 1 mile in length and really quite narrow. So I got dropped off there by a local boatman who was going to come back 24 hours later. There is a great difficulty in getting to and from the island due to tidal races. And so he said, would you mind if I left you overnight? And I was like, oh, fantastic. I'd love that. I hadn't really thought it all the way through because this location really, I felt it to be physically safe from a rational point of view. I mean, sure, there were the cattle, but you could see them coming. They're big and there's no trees on the island. So I don't know what it did to my brain, the sort of extreme solitude that you find on an abandoned island. Knowing there's no escape, my phone gave up very quickly, almost as soon as I arrived. And that 24 hours is one of the strangest I've ever spent. You know, it started to get dark. Where I'm from, it doesn't really get dark in the winter. You maybe get an hour or so. And so I went up to the top bedroom, trying to get a few hours sleep and sort of bedded down. And then immediately I could, you know, hear this movement in the house. It sounded really like maybe a man running around, like running fast. And so I don't know what to think. I was pretty sure that there weren't other people on the island, but I wasn't that sure. You know, you can't be sure. And I had heard tell from the boatman who dropped me off. He said, just as he dropped me off, oh, by the way, do you know there's a tent inside one of the houses? You could sleep inside that. And there was this pause to be like, wait, what tent? Whose tent? Who left a tent? And he was like, oh, I don't know. He was very unbothered by it and immediately left. And then I go into the house looking for the tent. I mean, I don't want to sleep in the tent. Just the idea of opening it, you know. And the tent is gone. So there's somebody around, but I don't know when. You know, it's been a while since he was last on the island. And then I hear this sort of footsteps around in the house. And so I get up out of bed and I go down through the house, sort of stealing myself. And there's nobody in the house. And while I'm in the kitchen downstairs, which is really, you know, it's crumbling, there's tiles falling off the wall. It's very, I don't know, I was that kind of feeling of, I couldn't make myself eat or drink. I was sort of so anxious that I felt nauseous the entire time I was on the island. And I didn't really want to touch anything because it was sort of covered in cobwebs and it was becoming I was sort of stuck in a rut. And so I was downstairs in this kitchen where everything was collapsing and I heard it again, but it was upstairs this time. And so I go back up and I realize It's in the roof. And I've never really gotten to the bottom of it, but all I can imagine is that it was a very large seabird wandering about in the loft. I'm sort of knocking and it's not reacting and it's just walking back and forth all night. So it was me and this invisible force alone in the house all night. And I don't know, I guess I hadn't really known exactly what I was going to write about, but this became this almost like Hitchcockian episode. And again, I've been sort of nervous about how people would read it, but, you know, I think it turns out that other people are full of these irrational feelings and fears, and that my writing is increasingly coming about trying to combine these two things of that we can be both rational beings who are interested in scientific papers and irrational beings who are terrified and cannot sleep. And both of those things can be true at once. And I think that that is so much the case for all of the sites that I went to, you know, that they would be, as I say, you know, this is farm animals who are living outside of the normal structure of farm life. These are places that I didn't really know how to understand them until I understood that they could be both positive and negative, that we can live with that kind of moral uncertainty, and that it could teach us a great deal about the world that we live in, and that seeing the strange benefits or recoveries that were happening in these places also helped us to question our role as a steward of the natural environment, that often recoveries were happening that we couldn't predict, and that we can learn a great deal from these places. Anyway, I wanted to thank everyone for your time, your attention this afternoon. I would love to continue this conversation with anyone who would like to. I'll sort of be around. And as I say, it's just been such a pleasure to be here on your campus, having some very invigorating conversations. So thank you again for your time.
Now, I'm hoping you'll take questions. Yes. Yeah. Actually, I'm going to start with one that I think may be on a lot of minds here, right? So the book was published in 2021. So I imagine when COVID began, you were in the middle of galleys at that point. Yes. Would you mind talking a little bit about that intersection and where your mind was during the lockdowns?
Yes, absolutely. Because it was a very strange experience for me, because I'd written all of these sort of visions of a unpopulated future, and then in the process of redrafting the book or sort of making final fiddles, we were suddenly confronted with all these images of cities around the world emptied. And, you know, these strange reports of, I don't know, kangaroos bouncing through Adelaide's central business district, or, you know, okay, admittedly upturned ideas of Venice dolphins and so on and so forth. But I almost felt like I brought it into being. It was this nightmarish vision that I'd been dreaming up, and somehow I made it happen. And so it was very strange that these two things sort of combined in that way. And that by the time the book came out, people had been processing it in a way that I had also been processing it. And this sort of feeling or temperature of the room was very similar with other people. So it was sort of interesting to meet people in that way, in that sort of intellectual or mental meeting point, which you are all in the same mood or same sense of reflection. So yeah, I think from that point of view, the book, it sort of aligned with certain forces that were happening in the world otherwise, and it was an unsettling experience, I think is the best way to put it. Thank you. And if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
Hi, I'm Zitsenkova in climate studies here, faculty. So, and I'm also Bulgarian. So the Chernobyl story especially resonated with me.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things, I mean, I see this book, haven't gotten through all of it yet, but I actually picked up on the hopeful part of your narrative. So like, I'm really enjoying it. But one of the things you mentioned in the Chernobyl chapter was kind of this idea of, nature recovers so well if we temporarily or semi-permanently extract human influences. Like maybe we should, you mentioned Lovelock saying like maybe we should seed these various conservation hotspots with radiation. And that's of course very disturbing from a human perspective. So I'm just wondering, like, have you gotten any of that in response to your book, or have you gotten any of those kinds of fans that are perhaps uninvited?
That's a great question, because actually it's sort of something that I'm looking at more in my new work. So I'm looking a lot about, I don't know, ideas of fortress conservation and this kind of thing, when it's like exclusionary conservation and the ills that causes. I think the key things about the sites that I went to that, you know, I talked about this idea of like forbidden experiments, that the fact that they had happened inadvertently offered us this opportunity to find insight. Towards the end, I talk a lot about, these ethical ideas and how I find myself having again and again these conversations that I hadn't actually anticipated, which was people saying, maybe we need to have fewer people on Earth. And we started to see this coming to the fore during the time of the pandemic, when it was almost like a religious response, when people were saying, you know, maybe we deserve this. You know, like the first few months, do you remember that? That's certainly like, there was something inside people that almost, I don't know if it's something to do with our psychological makeup, but we started to interpret it almost as like like a warning or something that happened. And I think for me, partly because of where I'm from, where we have this history of the Highland clearances. So this is why a lot of the Scottish Highlands are perceived to be emptied and wild and a source of wilderness, is actually because they have been cleared of people. And so I guess I'd come from that place in my mind. I wasn't really anticipating people would encourage that. And so it is towards the end that I had to realize that actually I do need to deal with this explicitly and say, you know, I'm not arguing for this. And in fact, I'm not even arguing for the creation of more sites like this. It's more, what can we learn from a restorative point of view from these extreme examples that, and to start understanding abandonment again on this sort of continuum that we can have. You might abandon completely in the form of the exclusion zones. These are actually extremely rare to have them so tightly policed. But then you have something like a game reserve in South Africa, which has got a militarized force. And so that is to some extent an exclusion zone as well. And so that's now my area of interest has shifted onto this to be like, well, is it always the case that, you know, like human interest is in conflict with the natural world? And I think that's not the case. And it's so digging down into that exactly. So that's what I'm working on now.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Gilligan in Environmental Sciences, and thank you for this lecture. And my question actually follows very nicely on Z's. There's one thing that was really interesting to me running through this was both, you know, as you mentioned in your lecture, the role of people in these abandoned places and the kind of discomfort of letting go of control. So you talked about the bings and the control in the bings and the attempt to control life in Detroit. And it makes me think, in your book, you talk also about the High Line in New York, where you had this abandoned place that was becoming wild. And then there was this like, let's reclaim it and then let's cultivate it. And it becomes much less interesting. And then you talk at the end of your lecture about this discomfort of being in this wild abandoned place. So are there ways we can be looking at these little sites of abandonment in our cities, things like the High Line, and become more comfortable with not controlling them, not trying to turn them into gardens?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the High Line is such an interesting example because it really does show this way that we can value the same piece of land in so many different ways. And so that you can value it from a urban planning point of view a great deal. And at the same time also grieve the loss of this sort of self-assembling ecosystem that had formed there that was so remarkable and unusual. And you can also look at, say, the abandoned farmland that I was talking about, also in complicated ways. So we have this incredible carbon sink, but what you lose when you lose traditional farming methods is often you see a drop in biodiversity. And so that, you know, how do we deal with that? Like, what's the most important thing? You know, a question of priorities is a dilemma. As to whether we can become comfortable, I think that is a very hard one to answer. You know, that in fact, one point I was going to make and sort of forgot is that often when we talk about helping the natural world or saving the natural world, what we really want is this sense of gratitude at the end. Like it's baked into the narrative. Like if you look at those social media videos of like helping whales that are stuck with ropes around them, there's loads of these videos, and then they free them, and then at the end it does like a little bounce and like it waves its tail at them. Like the video doesn't work without the gratitude. For our brains, it's not enough for us just to say, oh, this is a good thing that we've done, or this seems to be good. We're sort of looking for something else that is unable to give us. And so with these landscapes that we're trying to save, if they become truly wild and uncontrollable and we don't have priorities for them, which might be like particular species that we're trying to have grow there or live there or whatever it is, we don't know how to think about them or how to feel about them. And that ingratitude from the natural world and the sort of chaos or maybe the fear that grows up in them, because it is actually, they do make you uncomfortable. Like that place in Swana, where I'm surrounded by seabirds who are just incensed that I am there, and you have to come to the conclusion that actually they don't want me to be here, and that's okay. That's what I was hoping would happen. It's you really have to be a kind of big person and allow. It's like a radical acceptance or like a handing over of power, and that these landscapes might not look the way that you want them to look like, and that if you're doing this handover of power, you have to be okay with that. And that's very difficult if you're a conservation body with goals and fundraising, and like the political side of that is very difficult. And so that's something that I think that we as a species, or the conservation movement and the environmentalist movement, have to figure out how to deal with, and whether we can still, how do you fundraise for a project like that? Because if you look at the rewilding movement, which I'm really interested in, it's just like a different thing to what I'm writing about. That is often very sort of like goal oriented in different ways, interesting ways. It's just a slightly different thing to, I guess, the phenomenon I was writing about, if that makes sense. Okay.
We have time for a few more questions. I specifically moved back here so I could pass the microphone off.
Hi, Giles Morrow from Anthropology postdoc. Just a question regarding the relationship between conservation and preservation to some degree. From an archaeological standpoint, we're looking at materials like the abandoned house that you have on the island. That is on the precipice of being a heritage position. This is a place to be preserved for that matter. So in your work in Detroit and other areas, where are you finding sort of the balance between allowing these areas to fall into ruin and the study of those ruins themselves? And was there any pushback in between the preservation of those areas and allowing them to fall into disrepair?
Yeah, again, this is another thing that's sort of difficult for us to sort of live with, is the loss, for all sorts of different reasons, some of them academic. And what's interesting is like the family that are associated with Swana, that abandoned island, in theory, I think they would like to turn it into a heritage site. They have a website for it, but it's just completely impractical. And what is happening is that because the different houses on the island were abandoned at different times. The most recently abandoned one is in the best condition, and it's the one that is most frightening to visit. It falls in this. I was thinking of, I talk about continuums of abandonment. You can see them as passing through vacancy, through abandonment, to dereliction, to something like ruinous. And around that time, they start losing their sort of emotional impact. So the sites that I was interested in were in this sort of uncanny valley, when really it felt like somebody had stepped outside of the room, but like a really long time, like long enough that mildew was spreading, or something. It was enough you could step in. They felt like real houses, but there was something a little bit off that made you very uncomfortable. And I spoke to somebody who'd been on the island. He talked about how he felt that he had to sort of shout every time he went into a room, because he was expecting someone to be like, hey, get out of here, this is my house. He had to knock on doors because of that sense of a living presence still existing. And so a lot of abandoned places, especially these ones that hit this emotional hotspot, are quite well picked over through this urban exploring process, or something like Chernobyl, where before the war, there were tourists going in. And so it was in a sort of unsettling dark tourism place just before the war. There was a strange amount of freedom to go wandering around in the ruins, and most of the valuables had been removed, but there was still a lot of, I don't know, say things like posters or some furniture was left. And they were just sort of on the precipice of becoming very bare. As to when do you want to save them? I guess so much of it depends on like their historical significance. You know, from my point of view as a sort of observer or more literary writer, I'm happy for them to slowly disappear. You know, like I'm interested in the ephemeral. To me, that is a huge part of the appeal. But I do understand that that's not necessarily how other people feel about it. And a lot of sites that are more ruinous are definitely into this sort of heritage region. And certainly in the UK, it might be the same here. A lot of our heritage sites were sort of rebuilt in the Victorian era. And so we have these, like where I am in Orkney, we have these Paleolithic sites which have been sort of reformed, or like Viking era sites which have been rebuilt. And so it's quite difficult to read them. And so I guess that as a slightly different thing has sort of taught me the importance of just like leaving things and reading them without getting too involved. But I'm not sure if that really answers the question, but
Actually, I think that's a lovely segue.
Okay.
So we might just leave that there with the hopes that there'll be more conversation to come to grow from it. I'd like to invite everybody to our reception. Cal will still be around. Please, if you'd like a little note in your book, or if you know others who, if there are copies sitting there and you're sure that there's someone who would really enjoy the book, please feel free to take it home and share it. Thank you for being here. And we'll talk soon at the reception.
No.